December 20, 1968, began like any other winter evening in Benicia, California. The sun had set over the rolling hills, casting a golden glow over the quiet town. But in the stillness of the night, a sense of unease settled over Lake Herman Road. It started with the sound of gunfire, shattering the calm. David Arthur Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16, were parked in a remote spot, enjoying a romantic evening. Suddenly, their peaceful night turned into a horrific scene. A car pulled up beside them, and a figure emerged, firing a handgun at point-blank range. The shots rang out, echoing through the darkness. David and Betty were hit, their bodies slumping in the car. The killer's vehicle sped away, leaving behind a trail of death and terror. The sound of screeching tires faded into the night, replaced by an eerie silence. The first call to the police came in at 11:15 p.m., reporting the shooting. Officers rushed to the scene, finding David and Betty mortally wounded. David died shortly after arrival at the hospital, while Betty succumbed to her injuries a few hours later. The investigation began, with detectives scouring the area for clues. They found a 9mm shell casing near the crime scene, a piece of evidence that would later become crucial in the case. As the news of the double homicide spread, the community was left reeling. The quiet town of Benicia was shaken to its core. Residents couldn't fathom who could commit such a heinous crime. The police were baffled, with no leads or suspects. The only clue was the shell casing and a report of a suspicious car seen in the area. The days that followed were filled with a sense of unease, as the town struggled to come to terms with the tragedy. David and Betty were just two ordinary teenagers, enjoying their lives. David was a high school student, with a passion for cars and music. Betty was a bright and cheerful girl, loved by her friends and family. Their lives were cut short, leaving behind grieving parents and a community in shock. As the investigation continued, the police were faced with a daunting task. They had to find a killer who seemed to have vanished into thin air. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. The case remained unsolved, with no new leads or breakthroughs. The town of Benicia was still reeling from the tragedy, trying to heal and move on. But the memory of David and Betty lingered, a reminder of the senseless violence that had struck their community. And then, on July 4, 1969, the unthinkable happened again. Another young couple was attacked, this time at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, California. The killer had struck again, leaving behind a trail of blood and terror. A phone call to the police followed, with the killer claiming responsibility for the attack. The voice on the other end was calm and collected, sending chills down the spine of the dispatcher. The investigation was about to take a dark and sinister turn, as the killer began to taunt the police with cryptic messages and codes. The game of cat and mouse had begun, with the lives of innocent people hanging in the balance. And in the shadows, the Zodiac Killer was watching, waiting for his next victim. The darkness was just beginning to unfold, and the nightmare would haunt the community for years to come. The killer's next move would change everything, and the clock was ticking. The summer of 1968 had been a tranquil one for David Arthur Faraday, a 17-year-old high school student living in Vallejo, California. He spent his days working at a local gas station, saving up for a car, and his nights cruising the streets with friends, enjoying the warm weather and the freedom of youth. David's daily routine was a familiar one: wake up early, grab a quick breakfast, and head to work, where the smell of gasoline and the hum of cars filled the air. He'd often take a break to chat with the regular customers, exchanging stories and laughter, the sound of clinking tools and revving engines providing a constant background noise. On the evening of December 20, 1968, David had plans to meet his girlfriend, Betty Lou Jensen, a 16-year-old student at Hogan High School. Betty was a bright and cheerful girl, with a passion for music and a love for adventure. She'd often spend her free time listening to records, reading books, and exploring the outdoors, where the sounds of nature and the rustle of leaves underfoot brought her peace. The two had been dating for a few months, and their relationship was still in that exciting, exploratory phase. They decided to go for a drive, enjoying the cool night air and the quiet of the countryside, the only sound being the soft crunch of gravel beneath their tires. As they drove out to Lake Herman Road, a secluded spot popular with local teens, the darkness was punctuated only by the occasional passing car and the faint glow of the moon. The road wound its way through the hills, the trees casting long, ominous shadows on the ground. David and Betty found a spot to park, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars twinkle to life above, the night air filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers and the distant hooting of owls. It was a peaceful, idyllic scene, far removed from the chaos and violence that was about to erupt. At around 11:15 p.m., a car pulled up behind them, its headlights casting an eerie glow over the scene. David and Betty didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another couple looking for a secluded spot. But as the minutes ticked by, the car didn't move, its engine idling softly in the darkness. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a gunshot rang out, and David's world was shattered forever. The sound of the shot was like a crack of thunder on a summer night, loud and jarring, leaving an echo of silence in its wake. The next few moments were a blur of chaos and confusion, the only sound being the moaning of the wounded and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. David and Betty were shot, their bodies slumping forward in a bloody, lifeless heap. The killer, his face hidden in the darkness, vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction, the only clue being the sound of his footsteps, fading into the distance. The clock on the dashboard read 11:20 p.m., the time frozen forever, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. As the night wore on, the police received a call, reporting a shooting on Lake Herman Road. The officers rushed to the scene, their sirens piercing the night air, the flashing lights casting an otherworldly glow over the carnage. They found David and Betty, their bodies cold and still, the only sound being the quiet rustle of the wind through the trees. The investigation was about to begin, a complex web of clues and suspects that would span years, and leave a community forever changed. And in the darkness, the Zodiac Killer watched, his eyes fixed on the scene, his mind already turning to his next victim. The phone rang, shrill and insistent, in the police station, a call that would change everything. The night of December 20th, 1968, was crisp and cold, the darkness pierced only by the faint moonlight casting an eerie glow over the deserted Lake Herman Road in Benicia, California. The clock on the dashboard of David Faraday's car read 11:10 p.m. David, 17, and his girlfriend, Betty Lou Jensen, 16, had parked in a secluded spot, a romantic getaway from the hustle and bustle of daily life. The only sound was the soft hum of the engine and the occasional hooting of an owl in the distance. As they sat together, lost in their own little world, a sense of unease began to creep in. A car had pulled up beside them, its occupant peering into their vehicle. The couple exchanged a nervous glance, their hearts beating just a little bit faster. The stranger's car lingered for a moment, then drove off, leaving David and Betty to breathe a sigh of relief. But the reprieve was short-lived. A few minutes later, the stranger's car returned, its headlights illuminating the darkened landscape. This time, the occupant got out, his footsteps crunching on the gravel as he approached David's car. The sound sent a shiver down their spines. Suddenly, a loud bang pierced the night air, followed by another, and another. The moaning of the wounded filled the air, a haunting sound that would echo through the night. David and Betty were shot, their bodies slumping forward in a bloody, lifeless heap. The killer, his face hidden in the darkness, vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction. The only clue was the sound of his footsteps, fading into the distance. The clock on the dashboard read 11:20 p.m., the time frozen forever, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. The car's engine sputtered and died, plunging the scene into an eerie silence. As the night wore on, the police received a call, reporting a shooting on Lake Herman Road. The officers rushed to the scene, their sirens piercing the night air, the flashing lights casting an otherworldly glow over the carnage. They found David and Betty, their bodies cold and still, the only sound being the quiet rustle of the wind through the trees. The investigation was about to begin, a complex web of clues and suspects that would span years and leave a community forever changed. Detectives began to survey the scene, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of evidence. They found a 9mm shell casing near the car, a crucial piece of evidence that would later become a key part of the investigation. As they worked, the darkness seemed to press in around them, the silence oppressive. It was as if the killer was still out there, watching and waiting. The officers' flashlights cast eerie shadows on the ground, making it seem as though the trees themselves were moving, twisting in the flickering light. The air was heavy with the scent of blood and gunpowder, a noxious odor that clung to everything. Every sound, every movement, seemed amplified, as though the night itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything was still. The police had finished their initial investigation, and the bodies had been taken away. The road was empty once more, the only sign of the tragedy a scattering of police tape and the faint scent of blood. But the darkness seemed to linger, a palpable presence that hung over the scene like a shroud. It was as though the killer was still out there, watching and waiting, his eyes fixed on the spot where David and Betty had died. The phone rang, shrill and insistent, in the police station, a call that would change everything. He was just getting started. The darkness of that fateful night still lingered, a haunting presence that seemed to seep into every pore of the investigation. Detectives poured over the crime scene, their eyes scouring every inch of the blood-stained asphalt, the surrounding trees, and the distant hills. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hum of a car driving by. As they worked, the detectives began to piece together the events of that terrible night. They spoke to witnesses, their voices hushed and hesitant, as if the memory of the tragedy was still too raw to be shared. One witness, a young woman who had been driving by the lake, reported seeing a car parked on the side of the road, its engine still running. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, in hindsight, she wondered if it might have been the killer's car. The detectives' eyes locked onto this new information, their minds racing with possibilities. They began to canvass the area, talking to locals and searching for anyone who might have seen or heard something suspicious. The sun beat down on them, relentless in its intensity, as they combed the streets, searching for that one crucial piece of evidence. And then, just as they were starting to lose hope, they received a call from an anonymous tipster. The voice on the other end was low and gravelly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I saw something that night," the voice said. "I saw a man, tall and slender, with a hoodie pulled up over his head. He was walking away from the lake, his eyes fixed on the ground." The detectives' ears perked up, their pencils scratching furiously across their notebooks. This was it, the break they had been waiting for. They pressed the tipster for more information, their voices gentle but insistent. "Can you describe the man's face?" one of them asked. "Was there anything distinctive about him?" The tipster hesitated, the line going silent for a moment. "I didn't see his face," the voice said finally. "But I saw something else. I saw a symbol, a cross with a circle around it. It was on the back of his jacket, and it seemed to glow in the dark." The detectives exchanged a look, their minds racing with the implications. This was the same symbol that had been found at the crime scene, the same symbol that the killer had used to sign his twisted letters. They knew they were getting close, that they were finally starting to close in on the killer. As they continued to investigate, they began to uncover more strange witness testimonies, each one adding a new layer to the puzzle. A local shopkeeper reported seeing a man matching the tipster's description, buying a pack of cigarettes at his store just hours before the murder. A passing truck driver claimed to have seen a car speeding away from the lake, its tires screeching as it disappeared into the night. The detectives' list of suspects was growing, their net widening as they cast it farther and farther out. They were getting closer, they could feel it, but the killer was still out there, watching and waiting. And then, just as they thought they were making progress, they received another call, this one from the killer himself. The voice on the other end was cold and detached, the words dripping with malice. "You'll never catch me," the voice said. "I'm always one step ahead." The line went dead, leaving the detectives staring at each other in frustration. They knew they had to keep pushing, to keep searching for that one crucial piece of evidence. But as they stood there, the darkness seemed to press in around them, the silence oppressive. The killer was still out there, watching and waiting. And he was just getting started. The phone rang again, shrill and insistent, with a single, chilling word, "Hello." The Zodiac Killer's twisted game of cat and mouse continued, with the detectives racing to uncover the next clue. The phone rang, shrill and insistent, as the killer's voice sent chills down their spines. "You'll never catch me," he taunted, before hanging up, leaving the investigators with more questions than answers. As they delved deeper into the case, the darkness seemed to press in around them. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the sound of rustling papers and muttered conversations. The detectives' list of suspects was growing, their net widening as they cast it farther and farther out. Arthur Lee Allen, a former elementary school teacher and convicted sex offender, emerged as a prime suspect. His fingerprints and handwriting could not be definitively linked to the Zodiac, but the circumstantial evidence was compelling. The detectives paid a visit to Allen's home, a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with tension as they knocked on the door, their guns drawn. Allen answered, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his voice dripping with hostility. The detectives exchanged a look, their faces set in determined lines. "We need to ask you some questions," one of them replied, his voice firm. As they questioned Allen, the detectives noticed something odd. A small, almost imperceptible twitch in his left eye, a fleeting glimpse of something sinister lurking beneath the surface. They made a mental note to look into Allen's alibi for the nights of the murders. The clock on the wall ticked away, the sound echoing through the room like a countdown to something sinister. The investigation led them to a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. The manager, a gruff, no-nonsense man, looked up from his newspaper as they approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low growl. The detectives flashed their badges, their faces set in serious lines. "We're looking for information about a guest who stayed here a few nights ago," one of them explained. The manager's expression changed, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Oh, you mean the guy with the scar?" he asked, his voice dripping with curiosity. The detectives exchanged a look, their hearts racing with excitement. "What scar?" one of them asked, his voice low and even. The manager leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The guy had a scar above his left eyebrow, shaped like a crescent moon. He was a strange one, kept to himself, but there was something about him that didn't seem right." The detectives' eyes met, a spark of understanding flashing between them. This could be their guy. As they left the motel, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. The air was cool and damp, filled with the scent of rain. The detectives walked in silence, their minds racing with possibilities. They knew they were getting close, but the Zodiac was still out there, watching and waiting. And then, just as they thought they were making progress, they received another call, this one from an anonymous tipster. "Look closer at the Lake Benicia crime scene," the voice said, before hanging up. The detectives' hearts sank, their minds reeling with the implications. What had they missed? They rushed back to the crime scene, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the ground. The trees loomed above, their branches creaking in the wind. And then, they saw it, a small, almost imperceptible symbol, carved into the trunk of a tree. The Zodiac's signature, a twisted cross-circle symbol, stared back at them, mocking them. The detectives' eyes met, a spark of determination flashing between them. They would catch the sky, no matter what it took. The darkness seemed to press in around them, the silence oppressive. The detectives knew they were in for a long, difficult night. And then, just as they were about to leave, they heard a faint rustling in the bushes. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down their spines. They froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The rustling grew louder, and then, a figure emerged from the darkness. The detectives' guns were drawn, their fingers tense on the triggers. The figure took a step closer, its face hidden in the shadows. And then, everything went black. The last sound the detectives heard was the soft whisper of a single, chilling word, mine. The darkness of the California night swirled around the detectives as they combed the crime scene, their flashlights casting an eerie glow. Every step, every movement, seemed to echo through the stillness. The trees loomed above, their branches creaking softly in the wind, like skeletal fingers reaching out. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and leaves, a primal smell that seemed to awaken something deep within. As they searched, the only sound was the rustle of leaves beneath their feet, the distant hooting of an owl, and the soft murmur of their own voices. The detectives' eyes scanned the ground, searching for any sign, any clue that might lead them to the Zodiac Killer. And then, it happened. A small, almost imperceptible symbol, carved into the trunk of a tree, caught their attention. The Zodiac's signature, a twisted cross-circle symbol, stared back at them, mocking them. The detectives' hearts quickened, their minds racing with the implications. What did this symbol mean? Was it a message from the killer, a taunt, a clue? They exchanged a look, a spark of determination flashing between them. They would catch the sky, no matter what it took. The symbol seemed to sear itself into their minds, a constant reminder of the killer's presence, his cunning. As they delved deeper into the case, a new lead emerged, one that seemed promising. A man named Arthur Lee Allen, a former elementary school teacher, had been identified as a potential suspect. The detectives' eyes locked onto him, their focus intense. Could this be the break they had been waiting for? They began to investigate Allen, scouring his background, talking to those who knew him. But as they dug deeper, they realized that Allen's alibi for the time of the murders was solid. He had been nowhere near the crime scenes. The detectives' faces fell, their disappointment palpable. Another dead end. The case seemed to be slipping through their fingers, like sand in an hourglass. They were running out of time, and the Zodiac Killer was still out there, watching, waiting. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The detectives were no closer to catching the killer. The symbol on the tree seemed to haunt them, a constant reminder of their failure. And then, just as they were about to give up, a new lead emerged. A cryptic letter, sent to the San Francisco Chronicle, claimed to be from the Zodiac Killer. The detectives' hearts skipped a beat as they read the letter, their minds racing with the implications. The letter was a puzzle, a riddle, a game. The killer was playing with them, taunting them. The detectives' eyes scanned the page, searching for any clue, any hidden message. And then, they saw it. A small, almost imperceptible phrase, hidden in the text. "I will kill again," it read. The detectives' blood ran cold. The Zodiac Killer was still out there, watching, waiting. The darkness seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening. The detectives knew they were in a race against time. They had to catch the killer before he struck again. The symbol on the tree seemed to loom over them, a constant reminder of the killer's presence. And then, just as they were about to leave, they heard a faint rustling in the bushes. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down their spines. They froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The rustling grew louder, and then, a figure emerged from the darkness. The detectives' guns were drawn, their fingers tense on the triggers. The figure took a step closer, its face hidden in the shadows. And then, everything went black. The last sound the detectives heard was the soft whisper of a single, chilling word, mine. The darkness of the Northern California night seemed to swallow everything in its path, leaving only an unsettling feeling of unease. It was as if the very fabric of the community had been torn apart, revealing a sinister presence that lurked in the shadows. The Zodiac Killer, a name that would become synonymous with terror, had struck again, leaving a trail of death and destruction in his wake. The first confirmed attack occurred on December 20, 1968, on Lake Herman Road in Benicia, California. David Arthur Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, two innocent teenagers, were shot and killed in a senseless act of violence. The killer, who would later claim responsibility for the attack, seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind only a cryptic message that would haunt investigators for years to come. As the investigation unfolded, a pattern began to emerge. The killer was meticulous, always seeming to be one step ahead of the authorities. He would strike without warning, leaving behind a trail of clues that were both tantalizing and frustrating. The 408-symbol cipher, sent to the Vallejo Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and San Francisco Examiner on August 1, 1969, was a prime example of this. The cipher, which included a twisted message from the killer, would go on to become one of the most infamous unsolved cryptograms in history. The Zodiac Killer's next attack occurred on July 4, 1969, at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, California. Darlene Elizabeth Ferrin and Michael Renault Mageau were shot, with Ferrin succumbing to her injuries. The killer, in a twisted game of cat and mouse, would call the police to report the crime, his voice dripping with malice. "I wish to report a double murder," he would say, before hanging up the phone, leaving the authorities to scramble for answers. As the body count continued to rise, the investigation became increasingly complex. Brian Calvin Hartnell and Cecilia Ann Shepard were stabbed at Lake Benicia in Napa County, California, on September 27, 1969. Hartnell would survive, but Shepard would die 2 days later, her life slipping away in a hospital bed. The killer, who wore an executioner's mask with a cross-circle symbol, seemed to take great pleasure in the suffering he inflicted. The final confirmed attack occurred on October 11, 1969, in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco, California. Paul Lee Stein, a taxi driver, was shot and killed, his body left to rot on the sidewalk. 3 teenagers would witness the crime, providing a description of the killer that would be etched into the minds of investigators for years to come. As the investigation continued, a psychological profile of the killer began to emerge. He was intelligent, calculating, and devoid of empathy. He seemed to take great pleasure in the fear he inspired, often taunting the authorities with cryptic messages and twisted games. The 340 cipher, sent to the San Francisco Chronicle in November 1969, was a prime example of this. The cipher, which remained unsolved for over 50 years, seemed to mock the investigators, its secrets locked away, waiting to be uncovered. The motive behind the killings remained a mystery, but one thing was certain: the Zodiac Killer was a master manipulator. He played on the fears of his victims, using their own terror against them. He was a chameleon, blending into the shadows, always seeming to be one step ahead of the law. And as the years went by, the legend of the Zodiac Killer only grew, his name becoming synonymous with terror and brutality. The darkness seemed to close in, the shadows deepening. The investigators knew they were in a race against time, but the Zodiac Killer seemed to always be one step ahead. And then, just as they thought they were closing in, the killer would vanish, leaving behind only a faint whisper of his presence. The symbol on the tree seemed to loom over them, a constant reminder of the killer's power. And then, just as they were about to give up hope, a faint rustling in the bushes caught their attention. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible. But it sent a chill down their spines.
The Zodiac Killer was still out there, watching, waiting. And then, everything went black.
The last sound the investigators heard was the soft whisper of a single, chilling word, mine.
The darkness of the Vallejo night was only illuminated by the faint glow of the Blue Rock Springs Park parking lot lights. It was July 4, 1969, and the sound of fireworks still echoed through the air. But amidst the celebration, a sense of terror gripped the small community. Darlene Elizabeth Ferrin, 22, and Michael Renault Mageau, 19, had been shot in their car, the sound of gunfire shattering the tranquility of the summer evening. As the police arrived, they found Mageau, bleeding and disoriented, but still conscious.
Ferrin, however, was beyond help, her life slipping away with each passing moment. The officers' flashlights danced across the parking lot, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The air was thick with tension as they searched for any sign of the perpetrator.
And then, the phone rang.
The dispatcher, Nancy Slover, answered, her voice steady as she listened to the caller's ominous words, "I want to report a murder." The voice on the other end was low and gravelly, sending a chill down Slover's spine. She tried to keep him on the line, but he hung up, leaving behind only the faint whisper of his presence. The police were now in a desperate game of cat and mouse, racing against time to catch the killer before he struck again. The investigation was on, with Detective Ed Rust of the Vallejo Police Department leading the charge. As the days turned into weeks, the letters started pouring in. The Vallejo Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and San Francisco Examiner all received cryptic messages from someone claiming to be the Zodiac Killer. The letters were laced with a sense of menace, the writer taunting the police with his cunning and intelligence. And then, there were the cipher's intricate codes that seemed to defy solution. The 408-symbol cipher, sent to the newspapers on August 1, 1969, was the first of its kind, a challenge to the authorities to uncover the killer's true identity. The symbols danced across the page, a maddening puzzle that seemed to have no solution. But the police were undeterred, poring over the codes, searching for any hidden clue that might lead them to the killer. And then, on September 27, 1969, another attack rocked the community. Brian Calvin Hartnell and Cecilia and Shepard were stabbed at Lake Benicia, the brutality of the crime scene leaving even the most seasoned officers shaken. Hartnell survived, but Shepard succumbed to her injuries 2 days later. The killer had struck again, leaving behind only a faint trail of clues. The executioner's mask with a cross-circle symbol, found at the crime scene, seemed to mock the police, a reminder of the killer's cunning and intelligence. The investigation was at a crossroads, the police desperately searching for any lead that might bring them closer to the truth. As the months went by, the letters continued to arrive, each one more taunting than the last. The Zodiac Killer seemed to be always one step ahead, his ciphers and codes a constant reminder of his intellectual superiority. And then, on October 11, 1969, Paul Lee Stein, a 29-year-old taxi driver, was shot and killed in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. The 3 teenagers who witnessed the crime provided a description of the killer, but it was like trying to describe a ghost. He seemed to blend into the shadows, leaving behind only a faint whisper of his presence. The police were now in a desperate bid to catch the killer, but every lead seemed to end in a dead end. The Zodiac Killer had become a master of manipulation, always staying one step ahead of the law. And then, just as the police thought they were closing in, the killer would vanish, leaving behind only a faint rustling in the bushes. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down their spines. The Zodiac Killer was still out there, watching, waiting. And then, everything went black. The last sound the investigators heard was the soft whisper of a single, chilling word, mine. The investigation into the Zodiac Killer's identity had been a long and arduous one, with countless leads and suspects emerging over the years. But despite the tireless efforts of the police and FBI, the killer remained at large, his true identity a mystery. The letters and ciphers he sent to the newspapers continued to taunt the authorities, a constant reminder of his intellectual superiority. As the months went by, the police became increasingly desperate to catch the killer. They scoured the streets, interviewing witnesses and following up on every lead, no matter how small. But the Zodiac Killer seemed to be always one step ahead, his ciphers and codes a constant reminder of his cunning and intelligence. The sound of pens scratching on paper, the rustle of envelopes being opened, and the whisper of the killer's voice on the phone all blended together to create a sense of unease that hung over the city like a dark cloud. And then, on October 11, 1969, Paul Lee Stein, a 29-year-old taxi driver, was shot and killed in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. The three teenagers who witnessed the crime provided a description of the killer, but it was like trying to describe a ghost. He seemed to blend into the shadows, leaving behind only a faint whisper of his presence. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, and the sound of sirens echoed through the streets as the police rushed to the scene. The police were now on a desperate bid to catch the killer, but every lead seemed to end in a dead end. The Zodiac Killer had become a master of manipulation, always staying one step ahead of the law. The creak of the taxi's door, the shatter of the window, and the thud of Stein's body hitting the ground all seemed to echo through the streets, a haunting reminder of the killer's brutality. As the investigation continued, the police began to focus on Arthur Lee Allen, a former elementary school teacher and convicted sex offender. He was the only suspect publicly named by the police, and his fingerprints and handwriting seemed to match those found at the crime scenes. But despite the mounting evidence, Allen's fingerprints and handwriting could not be definitively linked to the Zodiac, leaving the police with more questions than answers. The scratch of a pen on paper, the rustle of files being sorted, and the murmur of detectives discussing the case all blended together to create a sense of tension that hung over the investigation like a dark cloud. The months turned into years, and the Zodiac Killer's letters and ciphers continued to arrive, each one more taunting than the last. The police were no closer to catching the killer, and the city was gripped with fear. The sound of locks clicking into place, the rustle of curtains being drawn, and the whisper of people talking in hushed tones all seemed to echo through the streets, a haunting reminder of the killer's presence. And then, just as the police thought they were closing in, the killer would vanish, leaving behind only a faint rustling in the bushes. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down their spines. The Zodiac Killer was still out there, watching, waiting. The creak of a tree branch, the rustle of leaves, and the distant hum of a car engine all seemed to blend together to create a sense of unease that hung over the city like a dark cloud. The police were now on a desperate bid to catch the killer, but every lead seemed to end in a dead end. The Zodiac Killer had become a master of manipulation, always staying one step ahead of the law. The investigation was at a standstill, and the city was gripped with fear. The sound of footsteps echoing through the streets, the rustle of newspapers being read, and the whisper of people talking in hushed tones all seemed to blend together to create a sense of tension that hung over the city like a dark cloud. As the years went by, the Zodiac Killer's legend grew, and the case became one of the most infamous unsolved serial killer investigations in American history. The police continued to follow up on leads, but the killer remained at large, his true identity a mystery. The sound of a clock ticking, the rustle of papers being sorted, and the whisper of detectives discussing the case all seemed to blend together to create a sense of anticipation that hung over the investigation like a dark cloud. And then, in 2020, a team of amateur code breakers finally decoded the 340 cipher, a message that had gone unsolved for over 50 years. The solution was a major breakthrough in the case, but it provided no definitive clues to the killer's identity. The Zodiac Killer's true identity remained a mystery, and the case remained unsolved. The sound of a pen scratching on paper, the rustle of envelopes being opened, and the whisper of the killer's voice on the phone all seemed to blend together to create a sense of unease that hung over the city like a dark cloud. The investigation was still ongoing, and the police were still following up on leads. But as the years went by, the trail had grown cold, and the killer seemed to have vanished into thin air. The city was still gripped with fear, and the Zodiac Killer's legend continued to grow. The sound of footsteps echoing through the streets, the rustle of newspapers being read, and the whisper of people talking in hushed tones all seemed to blend together to create a sense of tension that hung over the city like a dark cloud. And then, just as the police thought they were closing in, the killer's voice seemed to whisper in their ear, "I am still here." The Zodiac Killer case, a labyrinth of unsolved murders and cryptic letters, has left an indelible mark on the city of San Francisco. The sound of pen scratching on paper, the rustle of envelopes being opened, and the whisper of the killer's voice on the phone all seemed to blend together to create a sense of unease that hung over the city like a dark cloud. As the years went by, the trail grew cold, and the killer seemed to have vanished into thin air. Yet, the investigation remained ongoing, with the police following up on leads, no matter how tenuous. The decoded 340 cipher, a major breakthrough in the case, provided a glimpse into the killer's twisted mind, but no definitive clues to his identity. The solution, a message that had gone unsolved for over 50 years, was a testament to the killer's cunning and intelligence. The police were still grappling with the meaning behind the cipher, trying to decipher the cryptic message that seemed to taunt them. The sound of footsteps echoing through the streets, the rustle of newspapers being read, and the whisper of people talking in hushed tones all seemed to blend together to create a sense of tension that hung over the city like a dark cloud. As the investigation continued, the police were forced to confront the dark nature of the case. The Zodiac Killer's letters, with their twisted humor and grandiose claims, seemed to mock the authorities, making them feel like pawns in a twisted game. The killer's use of cryptograms and ciphers added an air of sophistication to the crimes, making it seem like a battle of wits between the killer and the police. The police were determined to crack the code, to uncover the identity of the killer and bring him to justice. But the killer seemed always to be one step ahead, leaving behind a trail of clues that seemed to lead nowhere. The city was gripped with fear, as the Zodiac Killer's legend continued to grow. The sound of sirens piercing the night air, the flash of police lights illuminating the dark streets, and the whisper of people wondering if they would be next all seemed to blend together to create a sense of unease that hung over the city like a dark cloud. The police were under pressure to solve the case, to put an end to the terror that had gripped the city. But the killer seemed to be enjoying the game, taunting the police with his letters and ciphers. The investigation had a lasting impact on the city, leaving behind a sense of unease and fear that would never be fully erased. The Zodiac Killer's crimes had brought the city to its knees, making people question their safety and security. The police had worked tirelessly to solve the case, but the killer's cunning and intelligence had proved to be a formidable opponent. As the years went by, the case remained unsolved, a testament to the killer's ability to evade capture. And then, just as the police thought they were closing in, the killer's voice seemed to whisper in their ear, "I am still here." The sound of a pen scratching on paper, the rustle of an envelope being opened, and the whisper of the killer's voice on the phone all seemed to blend together to create a sense of unease that hung over the city like a dark cloud. The police were left with a haunting question: would they ever be able to uncover the truth behind the Zodiac Killer's identity? The city held its breath, waiting for the next move in the twisted game of cat and mouse. The Zodiac Killer's legacy continued to haunt the city, a reminder of the darkness that lurked in the shadows. The case remained unsolved, a chilling reminder of the killer's cunning and intelligence. And in the darkness, the Zodiac Killer's voice seemed to whisper, "I will never be caught."